Okay. I wanted to introduce you to the cemetery project. This will be your final project for the class. You'll be doing it individually. It will entail doing data collection, analysis, and writing up your data. And I like the project for many different reasons. But I think what you'll discover, hopefully, at the end of your project is you'll realize that cemeteries can be a really useful way to learn about economic, religious, political, and biological aspects of a past society. A lot of times when I read on the internet about cemetery research, many people limit themselves to the genealogy, the names of the people when they lived and died. And don't pay attention to other aspects which can tell us a lot, such as the kind of stone that was used, the iconography or symbolism on the stone, and how that changes through time, things like that. So, why do I have students work on this project? Well, one, it helps them understand how material culture and demographic information can help one learn about the past, right? So not just from historical records, but also from the archaeology. I think that it allows students to get more practice gathering and analyzing data, and this is something that's useful in all of the social sciences and beyond that as well. I know students who've graduated from Grand Valley and have gone on to jobs in the private sector where they've had to get data, present the data to, let's say the board or whatnot of a company. Improve your paper writing skills. Okay, so what do I want you to do? Well, you're not going to do any digging. That would be illegal. But you're going to go to a cemetery and you're going to collect the information from the headstones. So the first step is to locate an appropriate cemetery. You want to have a cemetery that has some time depth to it. You don't want to do, let's say, a cemetery that's been used from the 1960s up to the present day, because you're probably not going to get enough change over time to really sink your teeth into or to write about what's going on. And 40, 50 years is not enough, really. So you want to have a cemetery that has some time depth, that maybe goes back to the 1800s. Something that has at least 100 headstones. It could be local. I'm going to point out a couple of cemeteries where you can do your work. There's a historic cemetery in Allendale. There's one in other communities. Most towns in Michigan will have a historic cemetery. So one of the first things you want to do is to obtain a map of the cemetery. Many of these are found online on the cemetery's website. Sometimes not, but typically they're pretty easy to find. You can see all the plots are listed here. You could potentially use this map for your sampling strategy, but you don't have to. You could, if you wanted to, for example, pick some gravestones from each of the areas to try and space it out a little bit more. How are you going to select the individual headstones? Well, that's up to you. And as long as you justify your sampling strategy, that's fine. You can do anything you want. In the paper, you might end up talking about why a certain sampling strategy is better than another. But as long as you don't say, I chose the headstones randomly. I walked through the cemetery and I picked and choose different headstones. That's random. As we've talked about before, that is not a random sample because you're still doing the selection. A completely random sample would be if you had numbers for all the headstones and the computer picked out 100 and then you went to those headstones and took the information from them. That's a random sample. You don't have to do a random sample. You could, if you wanted to, walk through the cemetery and try and stratify your sample so that you're getting, let's say, make sure you have enough from 1850 to 1900, make sure you have enough of a sample from 1901 to 1950, etc. Right? So you can do a combination of different strategies. It could be non-probabilistic, it could be stratified, right? Different ways you can do it. What I would suggest is maybe taking a look at the cemetery online, maybe walking through the cemetery, and then coming up with an idea. There are several historic cemeteries in Grand Rapids. Oak Hill is one I know pretty well on Hall Street. Many of these cemeteries are very, very large. So some of you might want to work at those cemeteries, but there's thousands of headstones there, so some of you might be a little overwhelmed by just the sheer number. You can pick a smaller cemetery if you want to, right? But many prominent Grand Rapidians are buried in some of these historic cemeteries. This is a very interesting mausoleum. Mausoleum is and this you'll see in the instructions, the way to classify different headstones. Mausoleum is a building with a door that's very, very large. You can see this is Egyptian revival architecture. It's in the style of an Egyptian temple with sphinxes outside, dedicated to a very prominent citizen, A.B. Watson, who is a Civil War hero, and then I believe was a mayor of Grand Rapids or had some other prominent political position. What you'll notice is that some headstones are quite large, some are actually buildings, and one thing you might want to consider doing for your paper is looking at size over time and seeing what that tells you about the town of Grand Rapids or the town of Allendale or wherever you're looking. Some of you might want to go to the Nunica Cemetery. According to professional ghost hunters, this is one of the most haunted cemeteries in Michigan. It's historic, so there's some interesting headstones there. It's about 20 minutes you can see from campus. I'll just suggest it for those of you who want to do it. I obviously want to go during business hours for all of this. Typically, cemeteries are open to the public from dawn till dusk. Don't want to do it on Halloween, probably, because some of these cemeteries actually have fall cleanup on certain days where they're getting the cemetery kind of cleared of leaves. You'll kind of want to see. You'll want to go before all the leaves drop, I believe, because some of the flat headstones might get buried by the leaves and you won't see them. So I would suggest going in the next few weeks, essentially. And I have a date. These are dates that I want you to get certain things done by to help spread out the work. So that you're in good shape near the end of the semester. But you want to choose 100 headstones from your cemetery. You could, and I would suggest taking a picture of your headstone, because if you don't get all the information, writing it down, you could at least look at the picture. Or you might want to take brief notes and a picture for each headstone and do more of the data entry on the Excel spreadsheet later on. So there's an Excel spreadsheet included with all the information that you can use. You can add columns to it. There's certain columns that maybe you won't be able to use. That's fine. I would suggest putting in the year of birth and the year of death, because it'll be easier to sort your data if you just have numbers in those categories. If there's a month, you can put it maybe in this other column, birth and death over here. Ethnicity, you'll basically come up with a educated guess. So Adams, you would say, okay, British / Irish, right? But it's essentially a British, Scottish, Irish name. You can look this up on genealogy.com, right? You can look up different names and find out the ethnicity. So for the ethnicity column, you're coming up with an educated presumption. Wachowski, Polish. Schmidt, German, Vandenberg, Dutch. And this will allow you to potentially look at immigration patterns over time. You also want to look at the iconography, record that. So here the symbol is the Woodman of the World, which is a philanthropic society. Looking at membership of different groups is something that you want to pay attention to. The let's say shape, the size, right? So you might say, okay, this is an upright monument made out of granite. Granite, you'll see, has this granular texture to it. Granite preserves very, very well. The etching is usually very, very clear with granite, unlike limestone, which tends to wear away, as you'll see. So there's all this kind of information that you can get from the headstone. You might also have shared headstones, which you'll want to indicate on your spreadsheet. So you can take one individual. You don't have to do all three if you don't want to, but you can do one individual and then mark on your Excel spreadsheet that it was from a shared headstone. And then you can look at how many of your cemetery sample were shared headstones in different time periods and see if shared headstones increase through time, decrease through time, are found during mainly one time period, and this might tell you something about the society. Same with family plots. So sometimes you'll see family plots, usually indicated by a larger stone with the family name, and then smaller, you can see lawn markers or grass markers for each individual person. So this is Arthur Vandenberg, who was a U.S. Senator from Michigan. He was very influential in the formation of NATO after World War II. There's a statue of him. I believe it's still downtown somewhere. So this is his family plot and his, you can see, gravestone marker. So you could indicate on your Excel spreadsheet, individual whatever was part of a family plot. And you could see, all right, do family plots increase through time? Does their use decrease through time? Iconography is also very, very important. So here you can see that the anchor is symbolic, the handshake is symbolic. I am going to post a PDF of this book called Stories in Stone, where you can find out the meaning behind all of these symbols. Don't guess what the symbols mean. I've had students who have written papers where they look at the symbols and they interpret them. And sometimes they interpret them incorrectly. They come up with their own interpretation, but there is a historic and documented interpretation for these pieces of iconography. So we know what they mean. You just have to look them up in the book Stories in Stone. This is limestone, you can see over here, and it's worn. The limestone tends to dissolve in slightly acidic water. So, rainwater starts to dissolve limestone. Usually you'll see it's white or it has some sort of this is limestone over here too. It might have kind of a patina on it. So you might record the name of the person as well as the iconography, the shape, the kind of stone, that sort of thing. Okay, so overall, in terms of the schedule, I'd like you to have your data collection done by November 1st. Start entering it into Excel. Remember, if you don't have Excel, you can get it for free from IT. You can download it directly to your computer. Every Grand Valley student has the access to free Office programs. So Word, PowerPoint, Excel. I would recommend using Excel because it's a good kind of basic spreadsheet graphing program. If you want to go even further and use SPSS, we also have that at Grand Valley. That's a little bit, a little bit more challenging than Excel. Okay, before Thanksgiving, you will upload a chart on Blackboard from your data so that I can see, yes, this person is on their way to analyzing their data. And so, at this point, you want to be analyzing and making charts and graphs so that you can write it all up and submit it by the last week of class, that Wednesday, December 9th. Right? Okay, so there are many different topics that you can look at, and I'm going to show you some examples of what some students have done in the past. You can look at health through time. Is there higher mortality or lower mortality during different time periods? You can look at cultural change, right? Iconography. Is there more religious symbolism during one time period or another? Is there more iconography that represents the individual person during one more time or another? Technological change. Do certain stones vary with time? Are they using a certain kind of stone during one period and shifting to another stone? Why would that be? With all of these questions, you want to look at the bigger picture and try and answer why. And in order to answer these questions, you can use external resources like books and secondary sources, class and status. Right? So the size of the headstone could indicate the status or wealth of that person. And so you can look at size over time and see, is there a greater disparity through time? Is there do you see increasing wealth? That kind of thing. Ethnicity, right? You can look at ethnic patterns. So the percentage of different ethnic groups in different time periods. You can look at gender. How does gender correlate with burial treatment or health or some of these other categories? Kinship and social structure, like we talked about before. Do we see shared plots, shared markers, family burial plots over time? Okay, so here's a simple iconography chart. I would, again, recommend using a percentage histogram. It's the clearest kind of chart to read when you're looking at time period to time period. It's better than looking at the raw numbers. To create a histogram, you'll do exactly what you did when you were doing the battleship curves on your own. You'll create this kind of table in Excel. You'll enter the raw numbers for each, within each time period, how many had crosses, how many had willows, how many had angels. You'll enter the raw numbers. You'll graph it using a percentage histogram. It will figure out the percentages for you in the creation of the histogram. And so, for example, here, what you can see is greater use of the cross over time and more iconography through time in general in this plot. You can do something by stone. You don't have to hear the student separated the different kinds of granite. You don't necessarily have to do that. In fact, there may not be an advantage to doing that. It may be simpler to have limestone, marble, granite, slate, right? And I have a PowerPoint presentation that has pictures of the different kinds of stone you're going to encounter. Right? Size. You can estimate size as you're going around the cemetery or from your pictures. Right? You can have very small, medium, large, and extra large or monumental could be one of the categories. Here the student just created small, medium, large, and what you see over time is that there's less stratification. That is, there's less of a very, very poor population and a much wealthier population, and kind of it almost looks like emergence of sort of the middle, or maybe even the middle class, with less on the bottom and less on the top. That's one way of interpreting it, but there might be other things going on which you can suggest in your paper. One thing that we'll learn how to do is creating a survivorship curve. This is a great way of looking at populations over time. You're essentially looking at how the population dies off over time at different age categories, right? So you sort of look at, let's say, the entire population between 1840 and 1880, and at 0 years of age, there's obviously 100%, and then what percentage of the population are dying off from 0 to 10? What percentage of the population are dying off during this time period? Or what percentage are dying off by this age? Right? And so what you can see here is that in the early periods, there's a sharp drop already from by the age of 10. Right? So there's high childhood mortality, at least according to this graph, and then you could kind of see the trends there. You could look at male versus female. Are women in general dying at certain ages compared to men? Right? And there are many different ways to do it, but what you don't want to do is to, let's say, look at the size of the plots for the whole cemetery through the whole period that you have collected from, right? That is, you don't want just a pie chart here, right? At the bottom saying, headstones 1840 to 2004, small, medium, and large, because that really is not telling you much. It's lumping all of the time periods together. You don't want to do that because you won't have much to say about your data. You want to separate out the data by time so that you can start to look at some of these questions. Okay, so the format for the paper. All of this is in the cemetery paper guide as well. You'll have a short abstract. That's just basically a summary. I went to the Nunica Cemetery. I did a stratified sampling and collected 100 headstones. In general, this is what we see from the data, right? So kind of a brief summary of the whole thing. Introduction, you'll talk about the local history, the history of the cemetery with citations, right? So anytime you have a fact like the town of Nunica was settled in 1858, you need a citation for that. Your methods, your results, right? So, Chart 1 shows iconography changes through time, etc. Your discussions and your conclusions. So what do your findings mean? How can we interpret them? What do they tell us about a society over time? Generalize from that. Any other ways that you could further explore these questions. And then the appendix. You can have the charts within the paper, or you could have the charts at the end of the paper. Either way, there has to be 5 to 7 pages of text, of just text. You could also have your coding sheet in the appendix as well. So, just a couple general rules. Go to the cemetery during business hours. If you want, you can go with someone else. If you don't feel comfortable going alone, that's obviously a good idea. Also remember, if you don't have Excel, you can get Excel. And don't wait too long to collect your data. Michigan weather, we know, is kind of iffy sometimes. You don't want to have to worry about snow, because that's going to change your sampling strategy if some of the stones you would select are covered over and you can't see them. Okay, so essentially take a look at the cemetery project for now. Think about a cemetery you want to sample. Visit that cemetery, maybe start sampling it. You should be able to do all the sampling probably, in less than a day. It should probably take you maybe an hour or 2 hours. I forget how long it usually takes. But you shouldn't have a problem doing it. Pick a pretty decent day to do it. And that's something we'll talk about in future weeks. But let me know if you have any questions for now.